classes in session.
Welcome everybody to Unlearn 16 Classes in Session. Today, I am incredibly lucky to have Marty with me, who's this highly intelligent, articulate TikToker that I came across quite a while ago, actually. And the way that he constructs an argument and breaks it down and speaks about real life, I knew that I desperately wanted to have you on here. So Marty, thank you so much for coming on. If you want to give a bit of background about who you are, where you come from, whatever you think is pertinent, we're all yours.
Well, my name is Marty, and I'm Blackfoot, and I don't really know what else to say. I've done a lot in my life, and there's kind of like too long of stuff to just say.
Okay. What are your three highlights, let's say?
Well, I was raised as a ceremony person with our people from a very young age.
You want to explain what that is, just for people who aren't Indigenous or who have no connection to that culture?
Well, with our ceremony, there's kind of, it's really elaborate. Like people, I feel bad for them. One time we had this woman at the Sundance. She came over. She was from a tribe just one province over in Saskatchewan. And she was the head of the Indigenous Studies department at the university. And when she came to our ceremony, I saw her and I was like, oh, Tanya, I know her. So I went over there, walked over to her. And I was about to greet her, and she looked at me, and she had big, huge tears in her eyes. Like they were just welled up and red. And I said, I just kind of looked at her and I was like, oh, geez, you're crying. And I said, so what do you think? And then she said, we have nothing like this.
Wow.
What you are doing, we have absolutely nothing like this left anymore. And I realized that she didn't know what her people had lost until she saw what we had retained. Because we're the last to be colonized. Like they avoided Blackfoot people for a very, very long time. Yeah. And we weren't put on reserve until 1884 or so. And so it was quite a big shock to her to see what we still had.
Yeah.
And so without getting into too much detail, there's different, it's not just like one kind of ceremony. Like it follows the moon cycles, 13 moon cycles. There's seasonal stuff that we do. There's different groups that have different ceremonies within, and it takes, some of them take weeks to do, and so I get pretty exhausted sometimes when I'm there doing my thing with ceremony people. So it's quite a bit, but the good news is at this point there's probably a few thousand people who are involved.
Wow, that's amazing.
And, as a caveat to that, though, if you ever meet Indigenous men in particular who are claiming to be a shaman or a holy man, they're a fraud. Stay away from them.
Why is that?
Because they're snake oil salesmen.
Use that language.
Yeah. They're snake oil salesmen. They're just there to like use you for money or something like that. Because the actual ones, the real ones, they never talk about it. Like the ones that do kind of like healing with medicines or any kind of like personal body healing, anything like that. They never talk about it. And
why not?
Generally speaking, they're not allowed to. Not by any person, but by what gifts they have. They're not allowed to speak of it because they might lose it.
Oh wow! Okay.
Because it's a gift.
They would offer it then. You know what I mean? Like within the Blackfoot community, you would know.
Yeah.
But outside of that, they would just have to offer it. And
No.
How would that work?
They don't offer it at all. It's Blackfoot people know who they are, and so we go to the ones who we know who they are, and so they're not advertising themselves. They're not selling their services in any sort of way. We know who the people are, so we go to them. And
has that always been the case, or do you think that's like a protectionism that's been instilled in specifically Blackfoot people or any Indigenous nation for that matter because of colonization because and especially now with a lot of the appropriation that's going on? Do you think it's been that's to protect that gift a
Well,
little
I
bit?
can't really speak on other Indigenous people. Like, I don't know a whole lot about them because we're
Okay,
pretty well taught to just know about Blackfoot people. Eh?
right. Well, then
But
speaking directly for Blackfoot then.
yeah, one of my friends, he had actually gone to live with the Cree in Manitoba for a little while, for about a year. And he went to one of their sweat lodges, and they actually had their sweat lodge, inside a house, because what they did up until like mid 19th or mid 20th century, it was technically illegal for us to be practicing our ceremony, I think up until like the 1960s.
Right.
So people would be arrested for doing that.
Yes.
And so our practice at that time became like, if we're going to do a ceremony, we had to shorten it down to a day and get rid of the evidence right away.
Right.
But what some people did is they actually built whole houses
That were
where
just for
they,
that,
yeah, just for ceremony, they would hide it inside the
right?
house. And so that house is particularly for that ceremony, and they have blacked out windows where they could hide from the RCMP.
Because that would
And
have been
so,
a federal law, right? The
yeah, it would be.
criminalization,
Yeah.
that would have been federal, yeah. In like, I
Yeah.
think that was like 1947. It was probably under Mackenzie King. And then
He
who
was
lifted that?
horrible.
Was that what's that?
Mackenzie King was horrible. What
Just
a
the
horrible
worst.
man.
Just the absolute worst. And not when I teach about him, I mean, because I do teach Canadian history and I teach about him, I'm very holistic in how I speak about him because a lot of people, don't speak about all the horrific things. And this is obviously a significant, how do you criminalize something like that? Because he criminalizes it in 47. And then it continues to what? Diefenbaker, I guess, in the 60s? Is that when it gets
Hmm.
decriminalized?
I think
And
it was around like the end of the 60s, early 70s. I'm not exactly sure at the
okay,
time, but people
yeah,
were still very, like, there's tribes out there now who practice their ceremony hidden in
sure,
the bush still because they're still
absolutely.
scared of the RCMP, you know?
Uh-huh.
And so
Wow.
luckily we found ways of getting around it, like just hiding from them.
Right,
And we had actually never stopped our main stuff because there's just no way that they could stop us. Like
right.
they tried often. Like my great great grandfather, he was he was one of our weather dancers doing one of our main ceremonies, and he had been arrested actually for put in jail for several days after the fact.
For that.
Yeah, just
Like
for
it's
praying.
just for pray. Like this the age in which I teach this kind of history goes from like grade 7, so like 12 years old, up into grade 10, which is what 14, 15 years old. And when I talk about this kind of criminalization and I give examples, the examples I can give and as much insight as I can give it, right? The kids always sit there with their mouths open like, why why would you take time, even time out of to criminalize praying and dancing and it affects nobody, and they sit there with such innocence, which is quite lovely because obviously they don't understand the cultural genocide that was afoot, and unfortunately I'm the one that gets to explain it to them. But they just, you know what I mean? And now the kids are starting to get it in a much more significant way, obviously because of the massively increased notoriety of the murdered Indigenous children they're finding all over the country, right? So
Hmm.
kids are starting to gain awareness of that, and as they gain awareness of it, they constantly are looking into it. So trying to figure out, okay, what ceremony was banned when, by who, what were the consequences? And the interesting part about that is there's such little evidence. Like you're talking about the RCMP coming knocking in, arresting. The funny part is you go try to find that on the internet because really that's where we're looking at this point, right? And it's very difficult, if not impossible, to find that evidence
Hmm.
because you're only going to hear it through personal story. Because I'll tell you who's not putting it on their website, the RCMP. So it's just been washed. And yeah, it is nice to see the new generation seeing it with very, very, very clear eyes. But of course you'd be hiding it forever. How do you get rid of that fear? You can't just eradicate it. Oh, it's legal now? Great. Everything's good. I don't have to remember the last, 150 years.
Yeah, I think there's some protection, outside protection, because there were people who had come, like anthropologists, well, armchair anthropologists, even ethnographers, um, people who had come to study us or to stay with us. And some people did a good job. Like I think his name is James Willard Schultz. He wrote a
Amazing.
book called My Life as an Indian, where he had lived in with Blackfeet in Amskapipikani in Montana.
Right.
And so he tells stories about going on war raids with them and living how they lived.
Yeah.
And but then there's other people who had come in and they were just taking pictures and doing, and they were doing such, maybe partially intentionally but also unintentionally, misrepresenting what they were seeing, because they had no frame of reference for what they were looking at. So they
Right.
would interpret it in a weird way. But then, like, we have some of the most documentation on us, Blackfoot people do. And a lot of it is stuff that just armchair anthropologists were going around saying, oh, this is what they did. They're very
Right.
primitive, or this, that, they're very savage.
Right.
And so they would make up a lot of stuff. And that's what I worry about sometimes, because this actually
Yeah.
ties into the main topic, is that you can't trust. I was actually taught this from a young age. You can't trust what people are writing down about you.
Mhm.
You can't trust what is being documented, because people could easily lie and put it in a book. Anybody can lie and put it in a book.
Absolutely.
And so we end up, part of the danger is, like, when we're looking at Wikipedia or Google, because there's a lack of information out there, or a lack of true information out there, in some ways it serves us, because then they don't know who we really are. Then they
Right.
don't know how to speak Blackfoot. They don't understand who we really are. So in that way, they have the wrong idea about us, but we know fully well who they are.
Right.
So
Right.
there's a benefit there, but there's also this downside to where, a lot of youth aren't taught how to approach elders or to ask questions. Because, like, part of asking a question is that you kind of have to have a frame of reference, some knowledge to ask this question about what you're asking.
Right.
But if you don't know anything about it, then how are you supposed to ask the right questions to get to the answers that illuminate you,
Mhm.
And so part of the danger of relying on Wikipedia or Google or, those sorts of things is that it may not be there in the documentation that's available to us right now, is what I'm saying, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we talk very, very openly about that, and we have like Indigenous Fest, like a film festival in Toronto that is curated and created by Indigenous people of all different nations, and I've taken my kids to that because we speak a lot about trying to hear the stories from the people themselves and believe them when you hear them, right? I mean, that's one of the really important, and we're going to talk about language today, but that's where history truly lives, in the people that have lived it. And the closer I can get to that, and then the closer I can then bring that to my students, I think is the best kind of education. But you also are dealing with a community, and we're going to talk about language, obviously, but you're also dealing with a community. I mean, I'm from Ontario, and of course it would be true everywhere in Canada, that have been such horrible victims of such a level of violence, either physical or cultural, that it's very guarded, right?
Mm-hmm.
That your culture and your identity and what was and what is very, very guarded. So as somebody who's not Indigenous, trying to understand that, sometimes you come up against walls that I respect 100 and I understand 100%. And I teach my students to be respectful of those walls, and we talk about why they might exist and how we have to be respectful, of that and of the process it's going to take, if ever, for those walls to come down in any significant way.
Yeah. I think it's it's tough because there's some stuff that is really of no business to other people,
That's great. Like what? That's a
and
great.
like there's some ceremony stuff that we don't talk about because it's like, this is for the ceremony people. So it's like,
Right.
Even historically, not everybody was involved in ceremony. Like when it was just Blackfoot people in our territory, there was always a smaller group of people who were involved in ceremony, who knew what we were doing, who knew what we were on about. There were some people who, like prayer or traditional living, quote unquote traditional living, that wasn't ever forced upon anybody.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is people in the tribe who are just like, yeah, I'm just living my life, like just doing my thing. There was no gifts or medicines that they had. There's no paranormal stuff going on. There's no ceremony stuff going on. There was just they were just there living their life, and that
Right.
wasn't something that was forced upon people.
Right.
But at the same time, I was actually in one of your lives, and you were going on this back and forth about sex ed and elementary school students.
Yes.
And I so wanted to jump in on that. And this is, if you don't mind, I'll tell you this story.
Yes, please.
So, there's different kinds of stories that we have. And really, it can be viewed as like the creation story from the very beginning of time right up until now. It's actually one story. And it goes through different parts. So the creation story starts with the sun and the moon and the earth. And then it travels on to not be. And when people first came around. And not be is called the old man because when people came, he taught them everything that he knew. And once he taught everything that he knew, he went crazy. And so that's that kind of like trickster thing that they have, that kind of trickster, but it's not really that, like I think just sort of like academia, and like there's sort of analogous or parallel characters in other tribes. So like the Cree have Wisakechuk, and then I think for the Dene it's Wolverine.
Oh yeah.
But there's a very different, this is different because with Napi stories, there's children versions of the stories that are censored to some extent. Mm-hmm. And then there's like youth sort of adult versions of the stories that get more explicit and they get more to the point. Then there's the ceremony stories. But there's also stories that women would talk about among themselves and men would talk about among themselves. So some of these stories are really, really filthy stories. Like they're absolutely filthy. And can I tell one of these stories? Like sure. With the warning that it is filthy?
Sure. I always click the box that says, this isn't for kids. So
yeah. Well, so this story is about, that I was told was about the creation of the Old Man River. So Napi was known for having a very large penis. It was huge. It was massive. And there was this woman, one night there was this woman that had come in, and so she started having sex with him. And he was all for this. Oh, good, whatever. But it was the best sex he had ever had. And as the sun came up in the morning, she left. So he didn't see who she was. But she came back again the next night. And they had the most amazing sex ever. It was better than the last time. But the sun came up in the morning and she left. So this kept going on. Mm-hmm. And finally he said, I want to know who this woman is. I want to marry this woman. And so he decided what he's going to do is he's going to dig a pit beside his bed. He dug a pit. Yeah, he's going to trap her. Yeah. So they have she comes in the next night. They have great sex together. And then just as she's about to leave, he grabs her and rolls over with her and goes into the pit. And so they're both in there. They can't get out without each other's help. And he's waiting to see who this woman is because she would always leave. So as the sun rose and started getting brighter and brighter, finally she couldn't hide. And he said, turn around. I want to see who you are. She turns around and it's his sister. And so he is absolutely ashamed of all of this that had gone on. Absolutely ashamed. He's so ashamed that he starts crying. And he starts crying and crying and crying. But he's crying so hard out of shame. She starts crying out of shame that they just lose control of they void their bowels, and he starts peeing. So he's crying and pissing and crying and pissing. And they cry and piss so much that it fills up the pit. And they cry and piss so much that it creates the Old Man River. So some of these stories, they're not to be taken literally. You know, you're probably not going to forget that story anytime soon. That story is shocking to the senses. There's stories about Napi where he raped. There's stories about him where he turned himself into a baby so that he could get at this woman's large breasts. There's stories about him coercing women into sex.
By the way, I think Shakespeare stole all of his plays from these stories. I think they're all straight from there, but yeah, continue.
And there's stories where he murders even.
Wow.
So there's some really awful stories, but then there's also stories in there where he tricked some gophers into roasting themselves on the fire, but he let the pregnant gopher go because there should be more gophers. So there's always there's an embedded lesson of conservation within it. Absolutely. But the point of these stories is that what they were told as a means of education and social control.
Yeah.
So there's children's versions that are very moralistic. They're about stealing. They're about being honest. And they're silly stories. They're stories that are meant to make you laugh, to emotionally react. And then when you get into the youth and adult stories, that's where the sexuality comes in. Because Blackfoot people had recognized that there are stages of development psychologically for people. And the main stages are infant, youth, adult, elder. So infancy is from 0 to 25. Youth is 25 to 50. Adult is 50 to 75. And elder is 75 to 100. Because people would generally live to be about 100 years old. Right. Yeah. Throughout an appropriate lifespan. Anyway, the point of these stories was to proactively mitigate sexual violence, because you learned from Napi how not to be. You don't want to be like him. He is a fool. And I think what had happened more often than not too, and I've had this confirmed by other elders, was that things would happen in camp. Humans be human. So they're going to steal. They're going to get into sexual misconduct. They're going to be violent. They're going to murder. There's all of these things that they're going to do. And when there was something that was so outrageous that would happen within camp that they had to deal with, that would become a Napi story to teach other generations. Look at how foolish, how crazy this behavior is. So we don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So there's these books called, George Bird Grinnell had written, I think, Blackfoot Stories, I think is what it's called. There's others like The Old North Trail. In one of those books about our stories, the author writes, I have intentionally censored these stories because they are too raunchy and ribald for civilized ears. They're no good. So what he ended up doing was he removed the point of the story, because you can't mitigate sexual violence without talking about what sexual violence is. You can't mitigate these problems without being honest about them.
Yep.
And that's why it's important for children at early ages, when they're starting to interact with other people, to get age appropriate ideas of what sexuality is, of what the psychological development that they're going through, their body development, so on and so
Yeah,
forth.
absolutely. What a great and this is a lovely sort of transition into language, because what a great perfect analogy and comparison to what we think we're doing when we protect or we cover or we do whatever we do to young people or to adults, because let's be honest, we still love to censor left, right, and center. And when we do censor, what we're scrubbing out of reality, and if we scrub it out of reality, we don't know we have to face it. We don't know we have to have a discussion about it. We don't know it needs to be on the table, right? I mean, and that's what censorship a lot of the times does. And I've had, I don't know how many conversations about censoring language and what we can and can't say, and how we're supposed to interact with each other, and what civilized society, and I use that term loosely, looks like. But it all goes back to people, a lot of powerful people trying to control the narrative to make society work, right? We want society to work. And in order for society to work, we want less conflict, we want less uprising, everybody wants less violence. Nobody wants violence. But what do? Well, we ignore the reality to pretend as though we have it. And all that does is perpetuate the negatives, right? It allows the negatives to breed and to multiply, because we're not addressing them. So when I was talking about that, I don't know how much of the live you heard, but it was really in relation to Florida's laws about K through 3. That's why I was having that conversation, I think. And because the whole, the Don't Say Gay bill, which it's not what it's called, but the bill in Florida that's trying to control what we talk to K to 3 about. And what's interesting, or one of the foundational things I found interesting, is number one, the people that created the bill like to pretend and conflate talking about your bodies and talking about your gender and talking about your identity to, like, oh my God, we're teaching grade these threes how to have intercourse. Like, nobody's doing that anywhere, right? But most psychologists believe that and have studied that by 4 years old, kids start to gain a significant portion of their gender identity. And so kids can have a strong viewpoint of that. And for us not to talk about it at that age, if we're talking about age appropriateness, that if psychologists are saying this is when they start developing that, how do we not speak to that? And not in an educated way, but if a little boy walks in and he was born a boy and he walks in and he identifies as a girl, and I'm not going to talk about that as a teacher, I can't talk about that to the rest of the kids who are like, what? Wait a minute, that's not what my mom told me. My mom told me that boys are he's. So that's, or kids that have same-sex parents, are they not allowed to talk about that? Or books. You were just talking about literature, right? Books that have, nobody's saying that you shouldn't have a book with a mommy and a daddy in it. Nobody's arguing about that. Nobody's going to court and suing about that. But having a book, they want to take books out of the library that have same-sex parents, when they're trying to censor a reality, right?
Yeah, I think that problem has been, because like when this was in Victorian times that we signed the treaty, with Queen Victoria, 1877. Yeah. So, once the ethnographers had come to us, it had been in that time and post-Victorian era. So there's a long history of brushing things under the rug for the West, and like this kind of strange purity culture, like here even, when the Mormons had come up here and colonized their little area, Cardston, they were polygamous at that time, but they forget that history, or it's not that they forget it, they don't talk about it. It's not,
Right.
it's whatever. It's something that was done in the past.
Yeah.
And there's this constant kind of whitewashing of history in order to just sort of, we'll ignore it, and it's not a big issue because that's already done. We'll do whatever, like gibbet cages, where they used to just like people living or alive, just hang them in the streets on these on these metal cages.
How insane is that? Yeah.
Burning people at the stake, so on and so forth. Like there's a lot of stuff that's gone out of fashion, but that history of oppression and repression in order to just ignore those parts and hopefully it goes away. It doesn't go away. It just makes it weirder, like you get weird results when you have to repress this. And it's kind of on topic with what's his face, Ted Cruz, and his anti-racist baby.
Oh yeah.
He's like, they're saying this baby's racist, and there was a fella on TikTok who had read the book on his TikTok, and it's a short book. And once he read it, I realized right away, this book isn't aimed at kids.
No.
This book is aimed at stupid adults who are too stupid to understand. They're trying to break it down to you like this is what racism is, and they're trying to do it in a way that's like, you are so uninformed that we have to talk to you like you're a child.
Mm-hmm.
And they still don't get it. Like that's the
And I think, and I mean, when Ted Cruz did that, by the way, I bought all 4 books immediately. But nonetheless, like whatever book he held up, I said, I'm going to like that book. I can tell already. But what I find interesting, and we talk about people, and I would still say mainstream Canadian culture, and I would still say the majority of people think that by us actually acknowledging actual history, real, just like what you've described, right? Like real events that happen. So rather than saying that was never us, or we're not talking about that, or we're ripping that chapter out of the book and moving on with all the good stuff we've done since, if we can't acknowledge all of it, I'm not even going to placate and say history will repeat itself. What I am saying is we won't progress well. We won't progress as quickly as we could have if we would have put all of it on the table. All of it. The good, the bad, and the ugly. We put all of it on the table, including, like a lot of people, especially right now, you're finding, or I'm starting to find, this pendulum, right? Like why all of a sudden, it seems like all of a sudden you have, don't say gay, you have anti-trans laws, you have anti-CRT laws. Now this is predominantly in the United States, but it spills over into Canada. I saw a guy with a Trump sign just the other day. It spills over into here. And we have our own versions and bastions of racism and discrimination, all of our own anyway. But what I think we're seeing is this huge push by those communities and real gains being made by the trans community, by the gay community, right? By the Black community and Black Lives Matter and all of these things. And what we're seeing right now is the giant pendulum swinging backwards saying, no, 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 that's too much. You've gone too far. Everybody sees these laws as being a sign of this sort of these movements losing. And funnily enough, and in a way, I see it as winning. Mm-hmm. Because the only reason they're making the law, the only reason they're pushing so hard back is because a lot of good people, a lot of intelligent people, a lot of good-hearted people, which I think there's more than not, are making this push. So the only thing they can do is try to legislate it away. Let's quickly criminalize it. Well, we'll legislate it away and then it will go away. But all that's going to happen is another big push from the other side, right? Because you don't eradicate things like that.
I think that in part what they're doing with these laws is knowing that Trump had appointed a few Supreme Court justices, that I think they're kind of hoping that it goes to the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. But there's such a backlog of court cases that they're dealing with that this is going to be a fight they know for years to come. But like just throttle the system with all of these ridiculous legislations,
Yeah.
and in the hopes that it'll be won. But then meanwhile, what's her name? I can't remember her name. The lady that Biden is appointing.
Oh, Jackson.
Jackson. Yeah.
Ketanji Jackson. Yeah. Judge
And
Jackson.
so, like it looking just sort of outwardly looking at the United States, it's like, man, they got a super messed up system. And I'm just, I wish it goes better for people there. At the same time, it's almost like I found the United States to be kind of a canary in the mine for Canada,
Sure.
to see what's coming in the next little bit,
I agree. And we have that here, right? And we have that here in the, in the guise of gentlemen like Jordan Peterson. And again, I don't need to spend too much time talking about him, but speaking against, censorship of language, and then what does it mean, and who's trying to do it, and what are they trying to do, and how are they trying to control you? And I had a great conversation with one of my friends, because Bill C-16, are you familiar with that bill, right? The bill that was basically, so this is where Jordan Peterson got a lot of his notoriety, and this is 2016, where you start to see that push in Canada, or rather the pushback against sort of diversity and equity platforms and all of the pushes we've had for all different kinds of minorities in this country. And you start to see the pushback. And part of this bill was that, and I'm simplifying, you are to address people by the gender pronouns they identify with. Simple, right? And it falls underneath, you can't discriminate on the basis of sex, sexuality, race, ethnicity, yada. And they sort of added trans at the end of that very long list. And he gets up and says, well, I shouldn't, if I say that you're a he when you're really a she, or you identify as a she, I shouldn't go to jail for that. Well, number one, nobody is going to jail for that. So all of a sudden he escalated the punishment, right? To scare everybody. But I think what it did is it tapped into something, and this is why I listen to him, because I'm always curious at what it's tapped into in a silent majority in this country, in a group of people that stay silent, but then start to really agree with and get behind certain ideas and preconceptions or whatever that I thought we were long past, right? And you see that with Trump. Trump didn't create racism in America. He just started hanging out megaphones, metaphorically, right? He didn't create that sentiment. He made it subtly okay to actually express what you were really feeling, right? And so when people I can condemn Trump with the best of them. But what I don't mind that happened is it pulled the blanket back on how people are still really thinking. And I think that's incredibly important, right?
Yeah, it's good to, I think in the grand scheme of things, I'm under the belief, and I may be wrong, or this may be a hot take, that I don't know if there would have been a civil rights movement without the horrific things that had happened in World War II.
Interesting.
I don't know if there would have been such an interest in the rights of human beings and worldwide the United Nations and our interest in human rights without seeing how far people went with World War II so publicly.
I agree. Yeah.
Because if it, because there was horrific things happening this entire history, but stuff that we didn't see. So we didn't see, the Spanish Inquisition was 400 years in the making that had happened. There had been genocides. There had been just really, really awful stuff that was never appropriately documented or recorded. So like you could hear about, some ruler impaling people and putting them on their lawn, and or lining the road. Like you could hear that stuff, but if you don't actually see it, then
It's easy
it
to
doesn't have
dismiss.
the same impact, And I think that was a big, huge, that was a huge realization for the world that, like, well, we knew of concentration camps. They did know of them, like
Yeah.
there was people alive there. They knew. They couldn't deny that they didn't know, because it was known what was going on. Anyway, and it wasn't until they saw,
Yeah.
it wasn't until they saw, and then that they were forced to see.
Yeah.
And I think for a little while afterwards, I remember watching videos of Your Everyday Nazis were sat down in movie theaters and shown what was going on,
Right.
and the looks of some of the horror on people's faces, but others were absolutely smug, like almost enjoying it in a weird way.
Yeah.
Like it was so messed up. But anyway, all that being said is that there has to be that kind of very visceral, put a face, put a name on what's going on, and really show it. And once we see it for how ugly it actually is, we change within ourselves if we can appreciate that still.
Mm-hmm.
Like one of my pals, he was totally a white supremacist neo-Nazi type. He wore the suspenders and cut his hair in the same way, wore the jackboots and so on and so forth. And what actually changed for him was that he couldn't reconcile his belief in God, in creation, in Christianity, and these beliefs that he had about white supremacy. Like at the end of the day, he just couldn't reconcile those things, and it became one or the other.
Right.
And so he chose the flavor that he could, and he's enjoyable to be around. Sometimes that Nazi stuff comes out of him, like just out of the back of his mind still, but I'll just quickly make fun of him, and we'll have a conversation about it.
Well, it's interesting because I think, and a lot of people talk about physical violence, but and then very recently, I think a lot of people have been very much fixated and focused on language and the power of language. Like taking a person's language, as you incredibly well know, is genocide, and it's genocide from a cultural perspective, but you eradicate those people nonetheless if you decimate their language. And then being able to use language in today's context in order to create hatred, in order to incite violence, in order to set up the precursors to, just crime or hate crimes or genocide. And I see them all as actual steps, just in a progression of, I took a course on genocide, which was, really hard to get through. But one of they talk about the template. The template of a genocide is the same everywhere. And the very first thing you have to do is you dehumanize a person or a group of people with language in order to paint them as subordinate beings. Because you have to convince everybody else that they are less than. And whether we're talking about the Jews in Germany, whether we're talking about the Vietnamese and Japanese in the East, whether we're talking about indigenous people, you have to paint them as less than. And that language that people just discount as free speech, as whatever you want, that language is the first step. So a friend of mine and I were talking about this whole, should language be censored? Should it be dictated? Should it be enforced by the government? And my point is this. First of all, nobody's getting thrown in jail for saying a word. That's never happening. What we were focused on was in academic institutions, if you are a professor and you insist upon calling, for example, a young trans woman he, because they used to be a he, and that's just where your principles lie, and you're not willing to change for them. A lot of people don't see that as the potential and the spark of violence unless you're trans, right? And a friend of mine's like, well, you can't force that. I said, okay, given the same parameters, Are you allowed to use the N-word when talking about Black students? Soft A, not the hard ER.
Mm-hmm.
And her response was, of course not. I'm like, why? Why is that word not okay? Because I agree it's not okay, but why not? Because you see it as an act of violence, rightly so. But for some reason, because most of us aren't trans, most of us haven't lived that experience. We haven't seen the civil rights movement. We haven't seen, tens of thousands of young black men going to the Vietnam War. We haven't seen the media representation of that. Just like you said, we haven't seen it. It's not visceral yet. So I don't think we yet count it as being violent. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something that really came to my attention, you'd even said the word, was the parameters of what we're talking about. So I think when we get into things like when I used to be pretty active on Twitter.
Mm-hmm. It's a hard place to exist.
And yeah, once I joined Ceremony in a more official kind of way, I couldn't be around violence any longer. So I can't be around when people are fighting or, in dangerous situations, things like that, because we want to protect Ceremony people.
Yeah.
But it's a very high voltage place and we're dealing with pretty, powerful energies here.
Yeah.
And so I realized I can't, because one of the fun things that I would do was I would get into it for sometimes hours with neo-Nazis. Like just slowly, just going back and forth with them.
Chipping away. Yeah.
And it can't, I couldn't do that any longer because that's violence. Like just being on Twitter alone can be really, really violent space. But I realized at some point that we're not talking about the same thing when we're talking about racism. They think racism is this thing, like wearing a KKK hood or walking around with a swastika. And they don't recognize the subtleties or the everyday what is going on within the experience of Indigenous people or Black people, what's going on in that everyday experience that they're having. And they also view racism or what have you in a historic sort of way, that it's like, oh, you have, there was oppression back then. Residential schools were bad. We'll give you that. There was historical oppression, but none of that exists today.
Right.
So what's your problem now?
Problem? There we go. Yep.
And they really do. It's because of the parameters that they're operating within. So going back to, talking about the language of things, is that somebody had asked me at one time in my life, I'd seen a discussion, I don't know if somebody asked me, but how is colonization going on today? And how it's going on today, right now, this very moment, is that I am not wearing Blackfoot clothing. I have my necklace on. I don't have that option to wear the clothing that my people did. I'm the first generation to speak English first in my family. My dad spoke Blackfoot first. My mom spoke Cree first. All of my aunties and uncles spoke their language first, and then they had to learn English. So everybody in my family, from everybody older than, of my dad's generation, my mom's generation, they're all bilingual. Some of them are kind of trilingual even. Very smart people. I speak some Blackfoot. I understand a lot of Blackfoot. But my first language was English. Blackfoot people have social mores. We have ways of being. We have customs. We have traditions. But I have to give uptake to Canada's laws and Canada's ways of being. Canada has imposed itself upon us And no matter what I do, I have to give uptake to what they're doing. I do have to pay taxes. I do have to follow the social mores and the laws that are prescribed. I can't just take my tribe and go live in our territory. There's no buffalo out there, but our territory is dissected and bisected with highways and fences and private property and crown land. So there's absolutely no way that I could be wearing our clothing, speaking our language, following our way of life to the fullest extent that I can,
Mm-hmm.
that I could be, if I went back in time and saw pre-colonial Blackfoot people, I don't think they would recognize me. I don't think that they would understand that I am of them, because I'm so different in some ways than who they were. But I could recognize them because I could start to talk with them in their language. I could do the protocols, show them of what culture that I have been given over time. And it's not that long ago. Like 1884 isn't very long ago at all when we're put on reserve. The last buffalo hunters died in the 1960s and 70s, like it's not a very long time ago. And so all that being said is that I would give anything to be like how our people were. I would give anything to be living that life that we had, but I'm coerced into being in this way. And so it's like, yeah, I could technically choose my clothes. I could have been wearing a t-shirt. I could have been wearing a hoodie. I could have been wearing whatever is available to me technically. But I could have done some of this interview in a little bit of Blackfoot. Okay, what is going on is that they've put these parameters in here saying that you could interact in any way, anywhere you want. All of your freedom is in here within these strict parameters.
Absolutely.
And that's where I think people are not fully understanding. They're not fully understanding what you're talking about when you're talking about intergenerational trauma. They're not fully understanding about what they're talking about when colonization is still going on and how we're prevented from fully being who we are, But in turn, the landscape has changed as well. There's a lot of change that has happened. And for our own survival, we have adapted to this the best that we can, and that's probably the main reason why we survived, is our ability to adapt.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting because you spoke eloquently about having conversations, and what you realized is, in order to have conversations with people, genuine, articulate, useful conversations, you have to be operating under the same definitions. And when you disagree about the language and the definitions, you can't possibly have a conversation. So if nobody understands racism and nobody understands intergenerational trauma, or nobody understands what language means and what it gives a people, it's really hard, if not impossible, to have an authentic conversation. And you end up talking to people, and it's like talking to a bit of a wall, and then they get very defensive, right? They get very defensive of, I'm not racist. My family's not racist. I don't do this. I don't walk this way. My friends don't walk this way, right? And it's because of the way we've set up the language that is the problem. Because, when people talk to me about racism, or when people talk to me specifically in Canada, we speak about, Indigenous issues, and I do it quite often. I don't feel guilty. I feel responsible. And I often try to impress that, and I'll explain what I mean by that. I can't feel guilty for something I wasn't a part of. Don't feel guilty about that. It doesn't even make sense to me, but I can feel responsible for the way things are now. I can be responsible for the role I play in that, or my parents play in that, or the government play. I can feel responsible for wanting to create a society that is better without feeling guilty that I did it. And I don't think many people can separate those two realities. You know, they immediately go to guilt and then they get defensive. And you can't talk to somebody like that. You know, you're talking about the guys on Twitter. You can't have that conversation anymore.
Well, I think it's also interesting, just the aversion to guilt itself. And so with people making it about guilt, I wonder, because like that's a tactic that the alt-right, the Jordan Peterson types have, like what you were referring to before, is escalating and changing the parameters. So here's the reality of what they're doing. And this was escalated, changed, manipulated into something else, almost a different, just on the verge of being a different conversation.
Absolutely, they have. Yeah.
And so then you're not actually arguing about the reality of the situation. You're arguing about something else.
Yeah. And you're arguing about a fictional sci-fi built what if happened, and you're winding everybody up in the fear of that rather than dealing in what is.
And the intention of that is that because he has now set the parameters over here, there's no way that he could lose that argument to any satisfaction because it's not based in fact. It's not based in reality.
He created the fiction and said, well, you can't argue with my fiction, right? I'm sorry, I'll write a different story and we'll argue about it over here, but it doesn't make any sense. But what it does is it's kind of weird and unfortunately very, very smart. It has the potential and the ability to use a fiction that doesn't exist to support a reality so we do not have to look at externalities of that reality, to support what we think is, not what actually is. You know, when people say the good old days, I love it when people come at me and say, I wish school was like it was in the 60s. And I'm like, when your teachers could hit you? What did you like about the 60s? Did you like about, what was it, you know, let's make America great again, that whole thing. I'm like, what are we trying to get back to? Culturally, are we trying to get back to when minorities had fewer rights? What are you trying to get back to with that slogan? And for the most part, when we talk about the West, we're not really trying to get back to a society. We're trying to get back to a mindset because it taps into when we were kids, right? When you're 10 years old and everything's perfect because you don't know any better, that's what they're tapping into. And that is still a fiction. That is a fiction that never existed because you were young and you were watching cartoons on a Saturday morning. You didn't have to worry about gas prices and you didn't have to worry about the war in Vietnam and you didn't have to worry about residential school. Yes, you didn't know. So as a person, they're tapping into this unconscious, happy place we all have and using it against us in a way to halt any kind of progress. It's really quite sadistically brilliant.
Yeah, there's a historical precedent for this kind of stuff. Medieval Europe, you know, like just before the Renaissance, didn't know a whole lot about the Romans.
Right.
And so they picked and chose different things about them and created a narrative about the Romans that wasn't true.
Right.
And it became this kind of, so then this culture that they had born out of that was based on this picking and choosing of stuff they didn't really understand.
Right.
And giving accolades and credit to a culture like, you know, like we use the alphabet, the number system that we have, that comes from the Middle East.
Of course, yes.
It's not from the Romans. You know, like democracy has sprung up in different places throughout the world. The kind of democracy that they use in the United States is directly from the Six Nations, not from Greece, you know, not from ancient Greece. And so there's this kind of manipulation of history and romanticization of it that has happened historically. But then it kind of takes it off into this sort of tangential from the now. you know? Because like when people talk about here, oh, Indigenous people lost their culture. I sort of bristle at that because that's not necessarily true.
Mm-hmm.
So you have, the colonial culture coming along, colonization, capitalism, all those different things, sort of forms of capitalism that they had at the time, because it wasn't that
Wasn't like this, yeah.
official thing that we understand capitalism to be. But there was this meeting that had happened with Indigenous people going along doing their thing. And it's not that we joined up with them, because that's kind of what they wanted to do. They wanted us to assimilate into, die or assimilate. And eventually,
Absolutely.
once they realized they couldn't kill us off, they
Yeah.
tried and tried and tried to fully kill us off. When they realized they couldn't do that, then the efforts became assimilation.
Sure.
Because it's a lot easier. This is why they sent missionaries in first. Why they always sent missionaries in first is because it's a lot easier to get the people to believe in what you believe in. Because you could find like paintings of St. George and Quetzalcoatl, St. George overtaking the dragon. This is where hunting for Easter eggs came from in Jesus, Jesus comes out of the tomb and sees his shadow, and we have winter for 6 months. That's not how it goes. But
I know.
they obviously
I
had
like that
come.
version.
Well, they had obviously come into contact with people whose ceremony was, because the eggs
Mm-hmm.
are the first available protein in the spring.
Yeah.
So there was a culture of people who would go out there and have an egg hunting ceremony to get the first available protein. Happens around the spring when the rabbits are still white. So they took these cultural symbols and put them into their own stuff,
It's the
which
best
the
way to
Catholics have a
assimilate, right?
huge, in order to get them to assimilate. Say, so look, we're just like you. We have these things as well.
Yeah,
We
for
believe
sure.
what you believe, so come and
Come
join the
over.
real faith. So
Right.
they send missionaries in because it's very, very expensive to just have all out war with people.
Mm-hmm.
Why have all out war with them when you could turn them to fighting for you first? So send the missionaries in first, because then they'll turn and it'll avoid a costly war. So they want that to happen, but that's not what happened with us. We
Yeah.
continued on our ways, and we were forced to adopt stuff from them. But essentially, it was Blackfoot people then to Blackfoot people now being coerced into adapting for survival.
Yeah.
So this idea of losing culture isn't necessarily the thing. It's that we had to adapt. We changed. It's a changing of culture that had happened.
Right.
And that changing of culture that had happened is because we're still directly, the lineage is still directly to our old people, and the lineage is still directly there. However, it has been, it's a new context that we're
Mm-hmm.
in now. And, for good or ill, as much as I don't like it, this is still the reality of the situation, and that's, I think, something that people also don't seem to understand. And this is going back to Jordan Peterson. This is going back to that alt-right idea of taking the argument out here, set up the parameters out here, and be very busy talking about this while the reality is still happening.
Yeah.
While the reality is going on, it creates that tangent, that othering.
And I think it's obviously specifically done because if I can keep your arguing and I can keep your attention out here, life as I like it or as I know it can continue on,
Mm-hmm.
right? If I'm arguing up here, we don't change this, whatever this is, in whatever capacity. I know I've had you on here for a long time, but I want to ask you a quick opinion about what's just happened with the group of Indigenous people that have gone to Rome and the apology from the Pope. What? How do you see that? what's your takeaway from that? Like right now, like I didn't think he'd apologize, to be honest. When I heard about this, I'm like, he's not saying sorry. So I was a little surprised by that. Not that that really is this huge life altering thing, but what do you think about that? Because that's language, right? And it's language that's never been spoken before for some reason. Do you think that has significance, or do you think it's just lip service?
Well,
It's a big one, right? I don't like I haven't even spoke about it much because I can't quite grasp
one
it
of the
yet.
men from our reserve, he was appointed a judge actually in Alberta. He was a lawyer, and they used to call him Chief when he was in residential school. He later became a lawyer, and he was appointed a judge. And I think he is actually kind of sick now, so he's not really working. But there was an older priest who he had met at some dinner, like after becoming a lawyer. And so this guy had a big ring on. He would wear this big ring, like with a kind of a big jewel on it. And the priest saw his ring, and he said, "Oh, can I see your ring?" And so he goes, "Sure," because he knew the priest from when they were in residential school. So the priest took the ring and he looked at it and he put it on his finger. He looked at it, and then he looked at this. This priest is like 60s, in his late 60s. This guy is in his like 30s. The priest looks at this full-grown man, and then he bashes him on the head with the ring, and then he gives it back to him. Just kind of like the good old days, eh? Like, make America great again. Like that relationship, the priests had full control, even in town. The priest in this city would influence the mayor because they were Catholic. So the mayor would have a problem, or the priest wanted something done, he would go and he would tell the mayor what to do. So there was a time when the Catholic Church had this real, unquestionable power over society. And in the last while, Lethbridge has become more of a Mormon place. You know, there's a big Mormon influence. But what I've noticed about the Catholic Church is that unquestionable power that they had, they no longer have. Like that, for some reason or another, that power has shifted. And I think a lot of priests, maybe Jesuits or people who study at the Vatican or in the Vatican, they'll tell you it's because it's not old church values, or the devil has infiltrated the church and there's people who are possessed who are now leading it. They'll have all of these sorts of explanations. What I personally think it is that you give power, whatever you're giving your time and effort to, you're giving physical life force to it. You're giving power to it. And so because people were forced to be in Catholic Church on Sunday, they were giving their life power to the church from the ground up. And it's because that they were collected in that building that they gave that their energy to it. They gave their life to it, literally. And now that's not happening. There aren't people, the pews aren't full everywhere. Like there's fewer and fewer people because they can't reconcile, again, like even my neo-Nazi friend, they can't reconcile their beliefs with what has happened, what we found out about. I think the movie The Exorcist is actually about child abuse. It's about how adults fail children. Wow. And every adult in that movie fails the girl some way, if you paid close attention to the subtext.
Right. Yeah.
And there's even the psychiatrists, they were outright abusing her. The mother was neglectful. The father was really neglectful. And in the book, it's even kind of more obvious that I think it's different ways that people fail their children, and that it's about child abuse. And that's why the old priest dies, because I think they're kind of suggesting that once he sends the young priest out of the room, the girl's tied to the bed, he holds her hand. I think that it suggested that Father Marin, the old priest, is a pedophile priest. and that
Interesting.
in that moment where you don't see what's going on, where he dies. Because when exorcists go into an exorcism, they have to fast and pray beforehand. No food or water. They pray beforehand. And they're willing to live. They have to put their life on the line. The person who's possessed puts their life on the line. The exorcist puts their life on the line. And who they want to walk away is this invading entity. So because he died, the old priest, I think that he had done his misconduct. And that was his last chance. That's why he died. Anyway, there's themes of abuse all over The Exorcist. And that was something that at that time in the late 60s when it was written, 1973 when it was made, 74, they weren't talking about that.
You're right.
They weren't talking about the abuse. There were some people who were unquieted tones, but they were certainly punished if they had brought this up, their experience up. So it wasn't until well into the 90s that we had any sort of whiff of what the church was up to historically, when people started talking about, like, hey, what about this, you know? So only now do we realize that there has been a very lengthy history of child abuse within the Catholic Church, like just from the top down. If I'm not mistaken, that's why Cardinal Ratzinger resigned as Pope, because he was subpoenaed by the International Criminal Court to answer for, because they, at the end of the paper trail, he was the one, Cardinal Ratzinger was the one who was moving pedophile priests around different dioceses, giving the order. So the ICC had subpoenaed him to answer for this, so he stepped down. And it was around Easter, so my joke at that time was, oh, I guess the Pope gave up being Pope for Lent. But that's how we got Pope Francis. So if I'm not mistaken, there could be other explanations that people may have had. That's from what I understand had happened. Anyway, so with this apology, I think it's definitely meaningful coming from who we're dealing with. You know, like I started off with that story of that priest who had just like wrapped the head of this full-grown man, because that was the kind of power that he had. That was the kind of abuse that he could wield unquestioned. He's just like, oh, I could hit you over the head anytime I want to, you know. And the kind of stuff that they did, you know, like I've been collecting residential school stories from my aunts and from older people, and there's some really, truly horrific stuff that people have no idea about, like absolutely no idea about. And for what they had gotten away with for so long, having this apology and admitting that they're wrong, that's a huge thing given the history of who they are. You know, that's a pretty big deal given what they have become. You know, not even just what they say about themselves, but just given what they've done, what they do. And so that alone, I think, is a huge thing. How an apology is fine. What I would like to see is that all of the land holding that they have in Canada and the United States, all of the land holdings that they have, give it to the Indigenous people whose land that is.
There we go.
That would be
there's the apology, right? There's the I'm really sorry, and I watched it, and it did seem, you know, and whether it was heartfelt from him, the fact that the institution that's huge, but there has to be action. And I would agree with the legitimacy and the symmetry of that action. You know, like it seems it's not over, you know, it's not like this ridiculous set of reparations that nobody can. It's not talking about that. It's talking about something very practical, very clear, and very, you know, fair, very just.
See, Stephen Harper was the prime minister who had apologized for Canada's role in residential schools.
Yeah, I
And
remember.
so what had happened was that just before that had happened, there was a class action lawsuit of residential school survivors who had gotten together. So the Harper government quickly calculated that if they do a class action lawsuit and are on the hook, they knew full well they're on the hook for probably billions, if not into trillions of dollars, given the amount of survivors that there are and the atrocities done. So what they decided to do is like, okay, there's no way out of this. We have to acknowledge it. We're going to settle. So there's the Indian residential school settlement payments that were capped at, I think, $250,000, maybe $300,000 per person. That would be way cheaper than going through this.
I didn't even know it was that much. From what
Yeah.
I read, it was like, well, maybe that was the new settlement. Like I read $13,000 per person if you were still alive.
Oh, yeah. There was a basic level that was a basic threshold that everybody got.
Yeah.
But
and it was
how they made it more, do you know how they made it to be more? Was how much abuse you got. So trigger warning, this is pretty gross. This is about sexual assault and rape. Our old people were asked this question: did the priest ejaculate inside you?
Wow.
If he did, you got $2,500. If he
Stop.
pulled out,
if
he pulled out, you did not get that $2,500. Because what they set up across Canada were these kind of commissions, these boards. This is before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Oh, yeah.
These people, my parents and people of my parents' and grandparents' generation, they had to go to this sort of tribunal and tell this tribunal about the abuse that they experienced. And this tribunal then would check off boxes and tally up what their abuse was valued at to a certain extent.
There's the questions are one thing. How on God's green earth do you sit down and go, okay, so we need to come up with a number that signifies a priest ejaculating into a young, what? I know that number, what? $2,000? No, let's say $2,500 to round up. Are you, and what year would that have been in?
This was in the 2000s.
Right.
I'm guessing, I can't remember the exact year. I'm thinking around 2009-ish.
Yeah, right around there. Yeah,
it was around there, mid 2000s. Yeah, before 2010.
Here's the reality. Speaking of, here's the reality of the situation. That when people say how's colonialism still going on, there's the reality. There's the reality. A bunch of government officials knew what happened, heard the stories. Because let's be honest, we've heard a few stories outside of the Indigenous community. I realize people within the community have heard this forever, but the stories that we've gleaned, that we've gained access to. And to not have those stories as being fundamental truths put in historical context, put in the classroom, put on the governmental website, put every single forget the money for a second. Let's really talk about accountability, because $2,500 you can shove it for what just happened. Like, are you joking? But let's put some accountability on that. And the accountability is sure as hell not Stephen Harper, with the least authentic apology I've ever seen in my entire life, giving minimal sums of money to people that have endured that. Mm-hmm. I can't. And for people to say it's in the past, no, it's not.
That's well, I mean, my parents are alive today and they both went, like the one on our reserve closed in 1988. So I was 3. Wow. Had it been a couple more years open, I would have gone, But all that being said is that the Harper government realized what was coming in the most minimal way that they could to prevent having to lose this calculation. They they gave this a very facile, shallow apology, and here, pay them off. So I really didn't like that money. I didn't want anybody to take it, like, because there's a huge amount of poverty among Indigenous peoples across Canada. And what are you supposed to do when faced with poverty or get a few $1,000s? They're going to take the few $1,000s. A lot of people died because of that money. A lot of people died because you're giving money to poor people. You're giving money to people who are already struggling with addictions, mental health. One guy, there is a man. Okay, I have a little closer tie to this, the TRC and the meeting with the Pope that I wasn't so forthcoming about, is that my mom's brother is J. Wilton Littlechild.
Oh, wow.
So he was one of the commissioners for the TRC, and he's there. I think he's still in Rome right now, actually.
Truth and Reconciliation Commission, just so if everybody's here.
He had told us, so we were sitting there having dinner one night, and he had told us there was a man that had gone to one of these tribunals, talked about his abuse, and they were tallying up how much it was ready for. He hadn't confronted it the entirety of his life. He went home and he killed himself because it was the very first time that he talked about it.
Said it.
And that was a common thing that had happened. Like, people died because of it, you know, like it was something that felt very dark, very gross, very gnarly. And I didn't, but after the Indian residential school settlements happened, then the TRC happened, and the TRC I like, because what he had told me,
the next push, right?
Yeah. What he had told me was that the 94 calls to action, they didn't come from the commissioners. They didn't come from the government. They came from the people themselves. The people who were affected, they put these calls to action forward saying, this is what we want the government to do, because this is what we experienced, what we got out of this, what we see at this point in this time is what we want to see happen. And thus far, the Canadian government hasn't acted on most of those, but in different ways. Oh, and the other thing is, all of the calls to action are particularly directed at educators. They're not necessarily directed at governments. They're directed at educators. Teachers are the ones that they want to know this the most.
Well, they should.
But that being said, I had this story because during the Indian residential school settlement, my uncle, not Wilton Littlechild, one of my uncles from here, he was hired to kind of let people know about what they were doing. So he would go drive around and collect stories about residential school and then tell them that they're going to have this tribunal, they're going to have these settlement payments. And so he was sort of hired as a government scout, kind of, to go into the community. And he was working with this white man from Indian Affairs. So they were collecting these stories, but this white guy was just like, whatever, it's just another job. Like, he didn't really care about it. It was like, well, yeah, whatever. And typical kind of a Southern Alberta dude, they go to St. Mary's Residential School and they go down. It was still there for a long time. Once they closed it, they built Red Crow College. So I did upgrading there before I went to university for a year. So I spent a year in my dad's residential school, and just like, it was a wild place because they were never able to fully renovate it. So I saw it was all the same stuff, just that they added new tables. And except the crazy thing was that somebody had set fire to the chapel years ago. And so where the altar was in the chapel was all burned, and there's these black marks that went all the way up to the ceiling. And it was so wild to be in there because I would look at it. I would kind of break in there and look around and think, like, you know, this place where, like, God didn't want this chapel being here, you know, with what they did in this building. But so my uncle and this white fella, they're going around touring. They go down to the basement and they go down to the boiler room. My uncle goes around because they're doing a tour of the building. He goes around the corner and just kind of looking around this stuff over here. The white man standing at the entrance, and right in front of the man is the in front of the white man was the incinerator. My uncle comes around the corner and he turns to look at the white man. Right at that moment, a little boy wearing a long sleeved white shirt with no collar, like that kind of Mandarin collar, you know. He was wearing suspenders and black pants and the boots that they gave. He was wearing the uniform that they gave the kids. And he had his hair cropped to the side like they had just cut off his braids. This boy crawled out of the ashes. And then he stood up, just a little toddler. And he looked at the white man and he put his arms up like to be picked up. And he walked towards him and stopped and wanted to be picked up. And the white man's looking at him. And then immediately that boy disappears like he was never there. And the white man, he just lost what color he had in his face. He lost. He looked over to my uncle and he said, "Did you see that?" And my uncle said, "Yeah." So immediately he turned, he walked out, and he walked all the way out into the middle of the field. He was bawling and bawling and bawling and bawling and crying. And so my uncle just kind of waited, and it took him like a good hour, over an hour, to come back. He gets back to the vehicle, and his eyes are all red and splotchy. He's all swollen from crying. And he turns to my uncle and he said, "If they ever do anything like a ceremony or something to commemorate, to heal what had happened here, I want to be part of that." My uncle said, "Okay." But that day, the man quit the job because he knew that he had no business dealing with this.
Yeah.
And, that story is, it's a ghost story. Okay. I don't really care whether or not people believe stuff like that. Mm-hmm. It doesn't really matter to me. What matters to me is that the only way that this guy could understand the gravity of what he was doing was to be shocked into it. And the only way that we can have any kind of reconciliation is to have the truth first. And the truth comes down to how we talk about things, not in this weird set the parameters, argue about this bullshit over here, but the actual reality of what's going on. We have to stick within the parameters of truth. Stay within truth. Speak truth as best as we can and report reality. Understand reality and report reality with as little distortion as we possibly can. Because that, at the end of the day, that's what we have. That's really what we have. Like I sit there, there's some of these stories that I've told you and where I sat there and I thought, am I gaslighting myself? Is that really how it happened? And like, no, I'm going to tell the story because that's the story that I was given. That's what I had experienced. This is what I saw. Mm-hmm. This is what was given to me. I have to be true to that. And just for my own personal sense of being able to look in the mirror, to be able to be okay with myself. Okay? And I think that people, for somewhere along the line in the last few years of this dialectic, of this ongoing dialectic, this ongoing fight, the Twitter wars, whatever, people have really just steered away from that. And I don't know whose fault that is. I don't know if there's anybody's fault in that. I have some
suggestions. Yeah.
It's at the end of the day, and, maybe it's been Russia the whole time too. I kind of believe that, because in order to destabilize the West, introduce this infighting, because that's always been the divide and conquer kind of way. Get them arguing about things that
isn't that the nature of colonization? Isn't
Yeah.
that the nature of taking a people over? I mean, it's the nature, it is the very nature. And I think, and I thank you so much for sharing the stories that you shared. I know a lot of them, well, if all of them are incredibly personal and incredibly important, because I think I think when they speak about the Truth and Reconciliation Community and Commission, and they focus on teachers, I, I think the way we need to focus on education is through those stories, is through that personal history. It's not through analysis. It's not through, getting wrapped up in words and all of it's to listen to those stories that actually happen to people, sit and shut up and hear them. And I think that's the most impressive, amazing, powerful form of education that everybody in power is so horribly afraid of, because they can't control the narrative, because they can't control and then we lived happily ever after, because we ain't there. But we have to hear those stories, and we're so quick to it's not now, it's not now, it's not now. Forget it's not now. Listen to what was at the very least. How about that? Stop arguing about what's now to discount what was, and listen to those stories from a multitude of sources. You would have stories from the Blackfoot, from the Cree, from the Ojibwe, from all over the place, from African Americans, from women, from gay and lesbian. You start seeing these stories form, and instead of outrightly discounting them to prove a narrative, shut up and listen.
Well,
You
that's
know?
the intentional thing, because to get to now, you had to go through these steps. This is why people are talking about that history, is
Yeah.
because that history leads to
It is.
now. So if you're
This is.
discounting that history, then you can't be truthful about the now.
And on that, I think that should be on a shirt, by the way. On that amazing, without without summarizing too much, on that amazing end note, I would like to thank you so much for being an hour and a half. I mean, I have
Mm,
a feeling we could probably sit here for about 5 hours, but we'll
yeah,
do a
probably.
part two. We'll do a part two, part seven. I want to thank you, Marty, for being here. I am going to put all the places people can find you. If you want to give them just a quick synopsis of where they can listen to you and where they can gain access to you, if they're
TikTok. That's where I'm
TikTok.
at lately.
TikTok is where
I
you're
also
at,
have
and your handle.
Instagram, and
What's your handle on both?
I think Instagram is M Heavyhead, and then on TikTok it's Martin Heavyhead Jr. I think.
There we go.
I'm
I will
pretty
put them
sure.
both in the comment section below. But again, I'll let you check that. Again, I'm incredibly um, just thankful that somebody with your what also amazes me is that you have this breadth of knowledge that seems to go from the Middle Ages to Blackfoot history to US constitutional history. I mean, you're all over the place, because you understand, like most very intelligent people, is the pieces don't make sense, but the picture does. So you got to learn as many possible pieces as you can in order to construct a truth that is closer to reflective of the whole thing. And I appreciate that. I really thank you about that
Yeah.
and for that.
Yeah.
Well, thank
Well,
you very
thank
much.
you for letting me be here, and I hope it was
Anytime.
what people wanted. I don't know.
I have no doubt. And whether it's what they wanted, here's what I tell you, it's absolutely what they need. So I
Hmm.
thank you
Oh,
very
thank you.
much. I will see everybody here. Same bat time, same bat station next Tuesday. Thank you so much and have a great week. Dismissed.